The wanted poster felt out of place. Tacked to the wall of the post office, amidst flyers for bake sales and lost dogs, was the face of a cowboy. Stetson pulled low, eyes that could have stared down a charging bull, a jawline carved from granite. This wasn't some relic from a bygone era. This was Dusty Rhodes, public enemy number one. The FBI wanted him, and the reward for information leading to his capture was enough to make a man think twice about keeping secrets. Dusty Rhodes. The name, like the man himself, was a walking contradiction. He was a throwback, a whisper of the Wild West in a world of smartphones and self-driving cars. He lived by a code as old as the frontier, a code that honored loyalty, grit, and self-reliance. But somewhere along the line, Dusty's moral compass had spun wildly off course, leaving a trail of chaos and bloodshed in its wake. Now, the very lawmen who once tipped their hats to him were hunting him. They scoured the vast plains and dusty canyons, their sophisticated technology pitted against Dusty's intimate knowledge of the land. The chase was on, a modern-day Western pitting old ways against new, freedom against captivity, a lone cowboy against the might of the federal government, and America watched, captivated by the unfolding drama, questioning their own perceptions of right and wrong, wondering if a man like Dusty Rhodes could ever truly be brought to justice. Dusty Rhodes was born under a wide-open sky, in a town where the air tasted of dust and freedom. Dusty Creek, they called it. A speck on the map where time seemed to move a little slower, where men still wore their Stetsons with pride, and the values of the Old West were more than just stories told around a campfire. From the moment he could walk, Dusty was at home in the saddle. His father, a rancher with calloused hands and a weathered face, taught him the ways of the land and the language of horses. Dusty learned to ride before he could read, his small hands gripping the reins with an instinct that seemed woven into his DNA. He grew up under the scorching sun, mending fences, herding cattle, and chasing sunsets on horseback. He was a natural, more comfortable in the company of animals than people, more at peace in the vast expanse of the range than within the confines of four walls. He was, everyone said, a true son of the West, but even in paradise, shadows lurk, and in Dusty's heart, beneath the surface of the rugged cowboy, a storm was brewing, a restlessness that even the wide-open spaces couldn't contain. The first sign of trouble came in Dusty's teenage years. It started small, almost innocently. A few too many beers at the local rodeo, a fistfight that went a little too far, a reckless streak that had folks shaking their heads and muttering about boys being boys. But beneath the surface of youthful bravado, something darker was taking root. Dusty chafed against the constraints of small-town life, the weight of expectations, the invisible lines that defined right and wrong. He craved freedom, the kind that came with answering to no one, the kind that whispered of adventure and danger in equal measure. He fell in with a rough crowd, drifters and dreamers who drifted through Dusty Creek, leaving a trail of broken promises and empty bottles in their wake. He learned to play cards, to shoot pool, to disappear into the night with a flick of his wrist and a devil-may-care grin. The petty thefts started small, a few dollars from an unlocked cash register, a case of beer from the back of a delivery truck. But soon, the stakes escalated. A stolen car here, a break-in there, each act a transgression pushing Dusty further away from the values he'd been raised with and deeper into the shadows. Sheriff Roy Thompson had known Dusty Rhodes since he was a boy. He'd watched him grow from a scrawny kid with a mop of sun-bleached hair to a young man who could handle a horse and a rope with equal skill. Roy had seen the good in Dusty, the innate decency that lingered beneath the surface of his recklessness. But he'd also seen the darkness, the glint of defiance in his eyes, the quick temper that flared like a lit match near dry tinder. When Dusty's name started cropping up in connection with the recent string of petty crimes, Sheriff Thompson refused to believe it at first. Just a misunderstanding, he'd muttered to his deputy, shaking his head. Boys will be boys. But the evidence was mounting, and even Roy, with his heart full of hope, couldn't ignore it any longer. He knew he had to do something, to try and steer Dusty back from the precipice before he tumbled over the edge. One evening, he found Dusty leaning against the bar at the Silver Spur Saloon, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the murmur of hushed conversations. Roy walked over, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, and placed a hand on Dusty's shoulder. "We need to talk, son," he said, his voice low and firm. Dusty turned, his eyes narrowed, a flicker of defiance in their depths. "About what, Sheriff?" "About the trouble you've been causing," Roy said, his gaze unwavering. "About the path you're heading down. It's time to smarten up, Dusty, before it's too late." Dusty laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You got me all wrong, Sheriff. I'm just living my life." "This ain't living, son," Roy said, his voice tinged with sadness. "This is just surviving, and it's gonna catch up to you sooner or later." He gave Dusty's shoulder a squeeze, a silent plea for him to listen, to change his ways. Then he turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving Dusty alone with his whiskey and his demons. The robbery at the First National Bank was a turning point. It wasn't just the audacity of it, the way Dusty and his gang rode their horses straight through the heart of town, firing their guns into the air and sending the townsfolk scattering for cover. It wasn't just the amount of money they got away with, it was the cold-blooded murder of Deputy Ben Miller, a young man with a wife and a newborn baby girl, who'd made the mistake of trying to stop them. The news of Ben's death spread through Dusty Creek like wildfire, leaving a trail of grief and outrage in its wake. The folks who'd once turned a blind eye to Dusty's petty crimes, who'd whispered about his wild ways with a mixture of fear and grudging admiration, now saw him for what he truly was, a cold-blooded killer. The manhunt began immediately, a posse of lawmen and outraged citizens fanning out across the countryside, determined to bring Dusty Rhodes and his gang to justice. But Dusty, always one step ahead, vanished into the vast wilderness he knew, like the back of his hand. He was a ghost, a whisper in the wind, leaving behind a trail of fear and uncertainty. The people of Dusty Creek, once proud of their outlaw heritage, now lived in fear, their doors bolted, their windows dark. The cowboy they'd once admired had become the monster in their nightmares. Dusty Rhodes had crossed the line, and there was no turning back. The open road stretched before him, a ribbon of asphalt unspooling under a sky the color of faded denim. Dusty Rhodes gripped the steering wheel of the stolen pickup truck, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He hadn't slept in days, fueled by adrenaline and whiskey and the bitter aftertaste of regret. The events at the bank played in his mind like a grainy film reel, the images flashing before his eyes, the fear in the teller's eyes, the deafening roar of gunfire, the look of surprise on Ben Miller's face as the bullet found its mark. He hadn't meant to kill anyone. It had all happened so fast, a blur of action and reaction. But none of that mattered now. Ben Miller was dead, and Dusty Rhodes was a fugitive, running from the law and the ghosts of his past. He thought about the folks back in Dusty Creek, the fear in their eyes, the whispers that followed him like tumbleweeds in the wind. He thought about Sheriff Thompson, his face etched with disappointment and a sadness that cut deeper than any bullet. He had tasted freedom, the exhilarating rush of living life on his own terms, but it had come at a steep price. He was alone, adrift in a sea of guilt and uncertainty, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical burden. The road stretched on, a path to an unknown future. Dusty Rhodes, the cowboy who'd yearned for freedom, was now a prisoner of his own making, trapped in a cage of his own design. The manhunt for Dusty Rhodes became a national obsession. His face, once familiar only to the folks in Dusty Creek, was plastered on wanted posters in every post office and police station across the country. Newspapers ran daily updates on the search, their headlines screaming his name, their stories painting him as a dangerous outlaw, a modern-day Billy the Kid. The FBI, their resources vast and their reach far-reaching, took over the investigation. They descended upon Dusty Creek, their suits and sunglasses a stark contrast to the dusty boots and Stetsons of the locals. They interviewed anyone who'd ever crossed paths with Dusty, piecing together a timeline of his crimes, trying to anticipate his next move. Roadblocks were set up on highways and back roads, helicopters buzzed overhead, their searchlights cutting through the night, dogs sniffed the air for any trace of his scent. The manhunt was relentless, a testament to the government's determination to bring Dusty Rhodes to justice. But Dusty, as elusive as a desert phantom, always seemed to be one step ahead. He moved like a shadow, his knowledge of the land his greatest weapon. He stole vehicles, slept under the stars, and relied on the kindness of strangers who either didn't recognize him or were too afraid to turn him in. The chase became a game of cat and mouse, a high-stakes battle of wits between a lone cowboy and the relentless machinery of the law. And as the days turned into weeks, a question lingered in the air. Could Dusty Rhodes, a man who lived by his own code, ever truly outrun the long arm of the law?